This week, we are looking at the idea of seeing the Earth as a system. So our goals for this lesson are first to understand the concept of a system and to apply that to the Earth. Then we're going to look at two specific systems within the Earth. So we're going to be able to explain the main stocks and flows that make up the hydrologic cycle, and then the main stocks and flows that make up the carbon cycle. So a system, in the most general sense, is simply a set of interacting parts. You've got different parts, they are connected to each other in some fashion. That makes a system. And a system can be either a closed system, which has no external interactions. It doesn't interact with anything outside of the system, or it could be an open system. So there are both the internal interactions among the parts within the system, but then they also interact with things outside of that system. And any one system can be made up of subsystems. So you can break the larger system up into portions, smaller open systems that each have their own internal dynamics, but then they interact with each other to make this larger system. And then, of course, the subsystems can have subsystems, etc. So if we think of the Earth as one very large system, then we can break that down into some of the subsystems, such as the lithosphere, which makes up the solid portion of our Earth, the atmosphere, which is the air surrounding our Earth, the hydrosphere, which is the water on the Earth, the biosphere, which is all of the living things on the Earth, the cryosphere, which is all of the frozen elements of the Earth. All of those are subsystems within this larger Earth system, and then each of those systems have their own subsystems. So I talked at the very beginning about stocks and flows, and so this is one of our major ways of understanding systems. So the interactions that make up a system, the way that the different parts of a system connect to each other, typically involve the exchange of materials, energy, and or information. So there is stuff of some sort moving from one part of the system to another. And so if we are tracing the movement of those materials, energy, or information, we can look at those in terms of stocks and flows. So a stock is the amount of that stuff that's present in one part of the system at a particular time. Then a flow is the amount that moves from one stock to another stock over a given time frame. Okay, so our stocks are where we find our materials, energy, information, whatever it is that's being exchanged in the system. We have sort of pools of those that form these stocks, and then flows connect the stocks. Flows move stuff from one stock to another. A system would be considered balanced if the total inflows to each stock are equal to the total outflows from that stock. And in a condition of balance, the size of that stock will not change because you're adding as much to it over a certain time frame as you're taking away. And so that's, I think, easier to conceptualize if we look at something like a bathtub. A bathtub is a very simple example of a stock. Your stock is the water that's in the bathtub. Your inflow, your flow bringing water in, is your faucet. And so there's another stock somewhere else in your hot water heater, and the water's flowing from there into the bathtub stock at a rate determined by how you turn on your faucet. And then you've got an outflow through the drain. And so if your amount of water flowing into the tub through the faucet is equal to the amount flowing out of the tub through the drain, then your water level, whatever that water level is going to stay the same. You're adding exactly as much water as you're taking away, so that water level will not change. That would be your tub as a system in balance. If your system is out of balance, that means that your inflows are either greater than or less than your outflows. So if the inflows are greater, then your stock is going to increase. Your water level in your tub will rise, eventually overflow the tub. If it continues to be out of balance in that way, or if it's out of balance the other way, you've got more outflow than inflow, then your tub will drain. The water level will fall until that stock is down to zero. Your inflow immediately flows out through that drain. So if your system is in balance, if those inflows are equal to the outflows, your system will experience no change over the long term. There may be short-term cycles and fluctuations, but over the long run, if you have balance in your system, if your inflows equal your outflows, then your size of your stocks will remain the same, and so the system will not substantially change over time. If your system is out of balance, then the size of your stocks is going to change over time. Some are going to grow, some are going to shrink, and so that's going to change that system over the long run. So let's take as an example of a system that's one of the subsystems that makes up our larger Earth system, the hydrologic cycle. So this is the movement of water around through different stocks within our Earth. So there are different parts of the Earth that contain water, and we've got flows moving water between those different stocks. So what I've got up here on the screen is the most basic loop that makes up the hydrologic cycle. So we've got three key stocks. We've got surface water, so water that's present in liquid form on the surface of the Earth in oceans, rivers, ponds, lakes, etc. Then we've got water vapor that's in the atmosphere, so water in gas form in the atmosphere. And then we've got clouds. So clouds are droplets of liquid water that are suspended way up in the atmosphere, so they're not resting on the surface like that surface water. And then we've got flows connecting these three stocks. So water flows from the surface water stock into the water vapor stock through evaporation. It changes from liquid surface water to water vapor, a gaseous water in the atmosphere. Then that water vapor can undergo condensation. It can return to liquid form somewhere up in the atmosphere, and that's how we get our clouds. So that adds that water into the clouds stock. And then, of course, clouds can produce precipitation. That liquid water can fall from the clouds, land in the surface water, and go back into that stock. And over the long run, these flows equal. So you may be having more precipitation at one point than another, but in the long run, the amount of precipitation that's putting water back into the surface water stock is equal to the evaporation that is taking it out. Our stocks are in balance in the long run. But you'll notice I've got two more stocks up there on the diagram that aren't connected with flows, because the actual hydrologic cycle is a little more complicated than this simple loop of evaporation, condensation, precipitation. We've got additional processes that create flows to and from these other two stocks, which are the biosphere and groundwater. So the biosphere, all of our living things on the Earth contain a bunch of water, right? Your body is mostly water. Same thing for all of our other living organisms. And so the biosphere is going to have flows of water into it from the clouds. Precipitation falls and is taken up by the biosphere. Biosphere is going to take water directly out of surface water stocks. You know, if you go get a drink from the river or something. And the biosphere is also going to get water from our other stock that we're adding, which is groundwater, water that's present underneath the surface of the Earth. So if plants' roots go down into the groundwater, they're pulling up on that stock, adding it to the biosphere stock. But then water will leave the biosphere stock through things like transpiration. So this is when plants do photosynthesis, they give off water out of their leaves in the form of water vapor. So that's going into our water vapor stock. And groundwater and surface water also exchange with each other. There are flows back and forth between those two. Seepage of groundwater out into surface water and infiltration of surface water into groundwater. So once we add in all of these additional stocks and flows, we get our more complete picture of the hydrologic cycle. And so again, this is a cycle that is balanced in the long run. If you were to add up the actual amounts of all of these stocks and flows, they would come out equal so that the size of each stock would not substantially change over time. So I mentioned condensation and precipitation as key processes, key flows within the hydrologic cycle. And I want to spend a little more time on those processes because they're very important when we get to our consideration of climate. So that's going to be a number of our lessons later on in the course are going to be about climate. So it's important to understand these condensation and precipitation processes. So these all center on that water vapor stock in the atmosphere, right? Our water in gaseous form mixed into the rest of our air. And we can measure the amount of water vapor we have in the air as humidity. So humidity, how much water vapor is in a given parcel of air, right? If we take a blob of air that we're going to analyze, how much water vapor is in there, that's the humidity. And there are two different ways that we can state the humidity of a parcel of air. One is the absolute humidity. So that's simply the mass of water in a given mass of air. So if we have a kilogram of air, how many grams of that are water? You can think of this also as sort of looking at how many water molecules are there in among all the other molecules that make up our air. We can also talk about relative humidity, and this is the one you're probably familiar with if you've watched the weather report, and they talk about, it's going to be 90% humidity today. If they're giving you a percent, they're giving you relative humidity. Relative humidity is a ratio, right? A percentage that compares the actual absolute humidity of the air, how much water vapor is in that air, to the maximum possible water vapor. Because air can only hold a certain amount of water vapor. So there is a cap on how much water vapor a given parcel of air can hold. And that cap is largely based on temperature. So the warmer a parcel of air is, the more water vapor it can hold. That maximum cap on the humidity that you can have, the absolute humidity you can have, is higher for warm air, lower for cold air. So you can see that demonstrated in sort of an analogy of cups of water in the first little diagram there. So in the first cup, you've got 6 ounces of water in a 6-ounce glass. That glass is 100% full. So you can think of that as 100% relative humidity, the capacity to hold water vapor and the amount of water vapor that's actually there are equal. But if you were to increase the size of the glass without changing the amount of water in it, now you've got 6 ounces of water in a 9-ounce glass. Now your glass is only 67% full. So your maximum that you could hold has increased. And so your percentage, your relative humidity has gone down. And then the third glass, your relative humidity has gone down even farther to 50% because now you've got 6 ounces of water in a 12-ounce glass. And then you could go the other way. You could go from your 12-ounce glass down to your 6-ounce glass. You could shrink the size of the glass. That's going to increase the relative humidity without changing the absolute humidity. You've got the same amount of water there, but because the maximum possible amount has dropped, your percentage has gone up. So if the size of that maximum is controlled primarily by temperature, then there's going to be a temperature at which your relative humidity reaches 100%. If you've got a certain amount of moisture in your air, a certain amount of water vapor, there's going to be a temperature at which if you cool that air to that temperature, you're at 100%. Your maximum possible humidity that you could hold in that air is equal to the amount that's actually there. We call that temperature the dew point. And the name comes from the fact that it's at that temperature that we start to get condensation. So if you go below that dew point temperature, then your maximum that you can hold is now less than what's actually there. And that excess has to go somewhere. That excess then becomes condensation. It returns to liquid form. And so if that happens at ground level, you're going to get the formation of dew on your grass. And your dew is water vapor that was in the air. The air cooled overnight. It cooled down to the dew point temperature and kept going colder. That excess humidity that could no longer be held in that air then had to come out as liquid condensation in the form of dew. So you can raise the relative humidity of a parcel of air by cooling it off. And you can see that illustrated in the graph in the lower part of the slide. The red line there shows you the 100% relative humidity or dew point temperature for different amounts of water vapor in the air. So you can see that when the air is 30 degrees Celsius, that's a real hot day, that you've got it's about 27 grams of water per kilogram of air. That's the maximum possible humidity that you could hold. But then if that air cools off down to 10 degrees Celsius, so that's, getting a little bit chilly day, then it looks like more like about 8 grams of water that you can have in a kilogram of air. And so if the actual amount of moisture that you had in your 30-degree air was greater than 8 grams per kilogram, if you cooled that air down to 10 degrees, that excess would have to go somewhere. It would become condensation. So if condensation, which is necessary as a prerequisite to precipitation, occurs when air cools off, then that means we can cause condensation by cooling air. And to cool our air, what we have to do is to make it go up. That's the main way that we'll get condensation, is when air is forced to go up, because the atmosphere is colder at higher altitudes. And you've probably experienced that if you've ever gone up to the top of a decent-sized mountain. You'll notice that it's usually colder up on top of the mountain than it was down in the valley. The atmosphere gets colder the higher you go. So if you take a parcel of air, if you take some blob of air and you make it go up in the atmosphere, it's going to cool down. And if you keep making it go up, it'll eventually cool down past the dew point temperature. And so you'll start to get condensation. That air will no longer be able to hold all of the moisture that it might have absorbed when it was at ground level and warmer. So there are a bunch of different ways that we can make a parcel of air go up, resulting in cooling, eventually in condensation when it can no longer hold on to all of that moisture. One way to do that is localized instability. So if our parcel of air is warmer than the air around it, warm air rises, it's going to start to go up. So it's going to cool off as it goes up. But as long as the air around it is still even colder, then that parcel of air will continue to rise and eventually hit the dew point temperature, get condensation, form clouds that can eventually cause precipitation. You also can make air move up by having it go over a mountain. And that's what you see in the first diagram. There are winds are blowing horizontally across the ground, but they have to go up to get over the top of that mountain. And so as they go up the mountain, they're going to cool off. Eventually, you'll get to the dew point temperature. And as you go below the dew point temperature, you can't hold on to all that moisture anymore. You get condensation that will form clouds. Eventually, those clouds will cause precipitation. But then as soon as the air gets over to the other side of the mountain, and it's now going down, it's warming up. And so its capacity to hold moisture is going to increase. And so you're no longer going to get condensation happening on the far side of the mountain where the air is now going down. Another way we can make air go up is through an atmospheric front. And so this is another thing you've probably heard on the weather report. They talk about a cold front's coming in, a warm front's coming in. Basically what's happening at one of these fronts is that one mass of air is getting pushed up on top of another. So rather than going over a solid mountain, a parcel of air is going up over a different parcel of air. And so as that parcel of air rises to go up over another one, it's going to cool off. As it cools off, relative humidity increases, eventually hits 100% at that dew point temperature, and you'll get condensation, which can lead to precipitation. So that's why when a front is coming through, you see lots of clouds in the sky. You potentially get precipitation, rain or snow happening. But if you're in the middle of one of those big parcels of air, so nothing is being pushed upward onto anything else, you get nice clear skies. There's nothing raising that air, causing it to cool off and eventually have condensation. And then the last way that we can move air up is something that we'll talk about in more detail in a later lesson, so I'm not going to dwell on it here, but I just want to make note of it, that the primary circulation of the atmosphere, so the very broad scale patterns of how the air moves in our atmosphere. There are some parts of the world, such as the equator, where we have our air moving up, circulating outwards and coming back down elsewhere on the Earth. And so when that air is moving up in these global scale circulation patterns, it's going to get the same thing happening. The air rises, it cools off, relative humidity increases, eventually you hit the dew point temperature, continue to cool, you're going to get precipitation because it can't hold on to all that moisture in water vapor form anymore. So that's the hydrologic cycle. Now let's talk about the carbon cycle. This is another very important cycle, and it's one that's going to be very important as we move on to talk about processes of climate change. So what I've got on the screen here is the most basic loop of the carbon cycle. So we've got three major stalks here. So you've got a stalk of carbon in the atmosphere, mainly in the form of carbon dioxide. So we've got our element of carbon that is in the form of carbon dioxide attached to some oxygen atoms, and that's in our atmosphere. That's one stalk of carbon in our world. That carbon is removed from the atmosphere. It flows from the atmospheric stalk into the biosphere through the process of photosynthesis. So plants take in that CO2, combine it with other things to create all of the stuff that plants are made out of. So they're moving carbon from the atmosphere into the biosphere. Then that carbon moves through the biosphere from plants into animals through consumption. Animals eat the plants, or they eat animals that have eaten plants, or they eat something that has eaten something that has eaten a plant, etc. So all of that carbon moves from the plants up through all the different animals in our biosphere through consumption. Then the carbon flows back into the atmosphere through respiration. We, as animals, breathe out CO2. When we digest and break down all of that stuff that we got from plants or from other animals, we breathe out CO2 and it goes back into the atmospheric stock. So that's the most basic loop of the carbon cycle. We've got stocks in the atmosphere, plants, animals, and we've got flows through photosynthesis, consumption, respiration that move that carbon around that cycle. But just like the hydrologic cycle, there's a lot more going on than just that simple three-part loop. So let's add some complexity to our carbon cycle. So now we've got several additional stocks that have been added and flows that connect them to the existing carbon cycle. So the ocean has a bunch of carbon in it. There's dissolved carbon dioxide in the ocean. So there's a flow of absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere into the ocean, and then a flow in the other direction of outgassing of ocean CO2 back into the atmosphere. So we've got flows going both directions between the atmosphere and the ocean. The carbon that's in the ocean will eventually potentially form parts of sediment. It'll be taken up by living things in the ocean, which will die. They'll settle to the bottom of the ocean. It'll form sediment that gets compressed into rock. So we get another stock of carbon in the form of things like limestone forming at the bottom of the ocean. So we've got a flow moving that carbon from the ocean into this limestone. Then the carbon in our limestone stock can flow back into the atmosphere through volcanic activity. So the limestone can get melted and the carbon will be given off during a volcanic eruption and go back into the atmosphere. Another significant stock of carbon is fossil carbon. So sometimes when plants and animals die, they get buried. And so they take their carbon with them. They get buried under the earth. We've now got this fossil carbon stock. That fossil carbon stock was largely taken out of circulation in the Earth's distant past. We had a lot of formation of fossil carbon hundreds of millions of years ago, and it was just kind of stocked away, put away underground where it wasn't really participating in the active carbon cycle anymore until humans came along. And we discovered that if we dig up or drill for that fossil carbon in the form of coal, oil, natural gas, that makes a great fuel. So we can have human activities of mining and drilling, creating a flow from the fossil carbon underground into the stock of fuels that humans have. Okay, so that's the gas tanks of our cars and the bin of coal that supplies our power plant and all these other things. Right? That becomes a new stock of carbon created by people, and then we burn that carbon. And so the combustion of the fossil fuels returns carbon in the form of CO2 back into the atmosphere. So you can see we have a bunch of natural stocks and flows making up our carbon cycle, but then human activity has added new stocks and flows to the cycle. So human activity can modify one of these systems. We can change the size of a stock, we can change the speed of a flow, we can add new stocks and flows that hadn't existed without human activity. So what you're going to be doing in your lab assignment is first you're going to be creating your own diagram of the carbon cycle. You're going to be drawing out the stocks and connecting them with flows, and you're going to be putting some numbers to these. So in my little diagram, just had a bunch of arrows. It didn't show you really how much carbon was in each of those stocks and how much was flowing from one stock to another. You're going to put some numbers to it in your lab assignment, and then you'll be able to use those numbers to evaluate whether the carbon cycle is in balance or not. Are the inflows and outflows to each stock equal to each other? And then you'll be able to examine the impacts of human activity. So when humans add new stocks and flows, modify the amount that's happening in other stocks and flows, what does that do to the balance of the overall carbon cycle?